I stood in front of my own mansion door, dressed in worn-out clothes with dust clinging to my sleeves. My hair was messy, and I'd purposely smudged my face to make it look worse. In the dark, I looked no different from someone lost and trying to sleep under a stranger's porch. The wind hit my face, freezing cold, but not as cold as the reason I was here. The door swung open. Zoe stood there. The light behind her cast a thin glow over me. She looked at me for a few seconds, long enough to think it over. Then she pushed the door open a little wider. "Come in. It's cold out here." I hadn't even lifted my foot when I heard Paul's voice come from the living room. "Zoe, don't open the door. It's not our problem." His voice was steady, clear, and completely indifferent to the person standing outside. Zoe turned back toward him, then looked at me again, unsure, and I stood there in the dark, hearing every word. None of it surprised me. It only confirmed what I'd always known but never faced. To understand why I ended up here looking like this, we need to go back 12 hours earlier. That morning, I was still Marion Harrington, the head of a chain of high-end fashion stores, a place where the moment I walked in, every conversation stopped. No one made noise when I was around. I didn't have to raise my voice. One look was enough for everyone to know what needed fixing. Discipline was what I built my career and my life on. Sharp, precise, no room for mistakes. That's why I was wealthy, and also why I was so difficult that everyone feared me. Paul, my husband, was the complete opposite. He worked as a freelance business consultant, but most of the time he leaned on the money I earned. I was used to carrying everything. He was used to letting me decide and living off the stability that came from it. Lately, he'd been drifting away from me in ways that were hard to notice day by day, but obvious when I finally looked back. Zoe, my daughter-in-law, is a preschool teacher. Gentle, simple, practical. To most people, those are strengths. To me, they were distance. I was used to luxury standards. She wasn't. When Zoe chose an outfit with the wrong color tone, I thought she lacked refinement. When she set the table too simply, I felt she didn't understand this family's standards. I didn't get angry. I just gave her the look everyone avoids, the kind that makes people feel they're not enough. But slowly, I noticed something strange. Zoe wasn't afraid of me. She respected me, but she didn't chase after every expectation I had. She didn't seek my approval the way my employees did, and that bothered me in a way I didn't want to admit. As for Paul, he was shrinking into himself a little more each day. At dinners, he was often absent. In conversations, he spoke less and less. His eyes never stayed on me for more than 2 seconds, as if my presence no longer mattered, or worse, wasn't needed. I kept quiet, watched. I'd always been better at analyzing other people's behavior than expressing my own feelings. But that morning, I couldn't avoid the truth anymore. I walked into the kitchen. Zoe was making tea for me. Paul walked past, didn't greet me, didn't look at me, just grabbed a water bottle and left. A small gesture, but clearer than anything he could have said. Zoe turned back and smiled. "I made mint tea. It's your favorite." I answered with a cold nod, and as I looked at her, I realized I'd spent too many years trying to force someone into the mold I wanted, instead of seeing who she really was. That afternoon, I sat in my office looking out at the backyard. I thought about Zoe. I thought about Paul. I thought about this big house. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I never dared to ask. If I no longer had the things that made them respect me, the money, the status, the power to decide, how would they see me? The question didn't come from hurt. It came from clarity. The kind of clarity that made me see the distance that had been forming for a long time, the distance I'd been covering with my success. Tonight, standing outside the door, I wasn't looking for an answer right away. I wasn't acting out a scene. I just wanted to observe from the lowest place, where the name Harrington couldn't hide the truth. I wanted to look at the two people in this house as if I'd never known them. Zoe with her quiet practicality, Paul with his familiar avoidance. And when Zoe opened the door while Paul told her to close it, all I needed to do was stand still in the dark, quiet, clear. Not to see who would choose me, but to see exactly where I stood in their lives. When I stood in the dark outside tonight, hearing Paul say those words to someone he thought was a stranger, I wasn't surprised. The feeling was simply sharp, like something I'd known for a long time, but kept pretending not to see. Indifference never arrives as a heavy blow. It slips in day by day, through tiny details. And I'd let it quietly eat away at my life without saying a single word. I remembered the months before that. Everything began with small frictions between Zoe and me. One day, she chose a new dress for a party. The color made her fade into the bright room. I told her to change. She smiled and said, "I feel comfortable in it." That answer chilled me. In my mind, no one walked into a family event where comfortable came before proper. But Zoe didn't think like me. She didn't care about matching my taste. She cared about how she felt. And that was far outside the logic I'd lived by for years. Another time, I asked her to set the table the way I wanted. My arrangement measured elegance. Zoe's measured practicality. I looked at the glasses sitting a few centimeters off and felt the whole evening was ruined. Zoe, meanwhile, thought it was enough if everyone sat down and talked comfortably. No one was wrong, but that difference to me was a thorn I couldn't pull out. I thought time would make her understand how my family operated, but Zoe kept her simple way. She didn't compete, didn't try to rise into any image. She lived the way she felt comfortable, and that bothered me in a way I didn't want to admit. She didn't seek my approval, and I wasn't used to people who didn't need it. As for Paul, he changed in a completely different direction, quietly, without showing it. He just slowly disappeared from small parts of our shared life. Family dinners had been our routine for years. Yet lately, he'd often let us know at the last minute that he had something to do. Sometimes he didn't say anything at all. He just didn't show up. I sat with Zoe and my son, leading the conversation, while he stayed somewhere else, avoiding my eyes. I looked at his empty chair more than the person in front of me. The feeling was strange and cold. I noticed he stopped asking me anything. He didn't ask how my day was. He didn't ask about work. He didn't ask how I felt, the way he used to so naturally. Paul had once been the person I could lean on when I came home after long, stressful days. Now, I felt like I was talking to a blank wall that couldn't respond. All those small things piled up. At night, he'd close the door to his office, even though I knew he wasn't doing anything in there except hiding. In the mornings, he left earlier, came home later, but without the tired look of someone who was trying. It was just emptiness. I never said anything. I watched it happen the same way I watched tiny mistakes from my employees, quietly, sharply, without noise. I didn't allow myself to let any emotion slip out. I'd held the unshaken image for too long. Admitting I was hurt felt like something I couldn't do in front of anyone, not even Zoe, not even Paul. And maybe because I'd kept myself in that stone mold for so long, I always looked at Zoe with judgment. When she didn't do things my way, I treated it as a mistake. When she did it right, I saw it as luck. That mindset made the distance between us impossible to close. But what kept me quiet wasn't Zoe. It was Paul. One evening, I was standing in the kitchen, organizing a few boxes. Paul walked in, grabbed some water, and walked out without looking at me once. I called his name. He stopped for a second, like he was obligated to respond, then just asked, "What?" in a flat voice. I didn't say anything else, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew he didn't want to hear it anymore. The truth was painfully clear. I'd been living next to someone who no longer saw me as a partner, just as a familiar piece of furniture. No care, no attention, no effort to change. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't pride. It was because if I said it out loud, it would become real, and I wasn't ready to face it. But this morning, watching Zoe try to make me tea the way she thought I liked it, and watching Paul walk past me to avoid a conversation, the question came back, stronger than ever. So strong I couldn't ignore it. If I didn't have this power, what would be left of me? I'd built my whole life on control, on standards, on precision. But what did any of that matter if the person living with me no longer saw me as important? If my daughter-in-law, the one I'd always looked down on, treated me with more kindness than my own husband? I didn't want an answer based on words. People always speak better than they act. I wanted to see their true nature, in real conditions, when I had nothing for them to lean on. No money, no status, no influence. I wanted to know who would open the door for me when I showed up in my weakest form. That thought led me to my decision tonight. It wasn't impulsive. It was the result of months of watching, nights of silence, hours of wondering what kind of person I'd become. I needed to see the truth, even if it was bitter. And so I chose the only way I could trust, disguise myself as a homeless woman, knock on my own door, and see who would pull it open. So I took the old clothes I used to wear when working in the storage room. I smeared some dirt on the shirt, messed up my hair, and erased every trace of elegance. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman no one would want to stand near. And tonight, I stood in front of my own house, looking exactly like that. When Zoe opened the door and looked at me with caution, but still with kindness, I felt a small sting in my chest. But when Paul said those words, "It's not our problem," I understood this test was more necessary than I'd thought. I stayed in the dark, didn't speak, just watched, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't the powerful Marion Harrington. I was just a woman waiting to see who truly cared. I was still standing in the hallway shadows when Zoe gently tugged my sleeve, signaling me to step inside. Her eyes didn't judge. They weren't overly curious. They held the natural caution someone has around a stranger, mixed with a quiet kindness I'd never bothered to notice in her before. "Come in. Let me get you a towel." Zoe's voice was soft but firm. No hesitation. I stepped into the kitchen. The space was so familiar I knew exactly where every cup was, but in this appearance, I felt like an outsider. Zoe sat me down. She poured hot water into a cup and slid it toward me with a careful, intentional movement. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't ask why I looked like this. She only said, "If you're cold, drink some water first." Her silence wasn't like mine. I stayed silent to keep control. Zoe stayed silent so I wouldn't feel embarrassed. I watched her hands tremble a bit as she opened the cabinet for a towel. Someone who was afraid of a stranger but still tried to be kind. That feeling hit me. Something I'd forgotten I could feel. I was sitting there when Zoe called toward the living room. "Paul, someone needs help at the door. I think—" Paul's voice cut her off, sharp and impatient. "No, don't get involved. Whatever people are dealing with, it's not our business." Zoe froze. She tilted her head, looking at me as if apologizing on someone else's behalf. Then she tried again. "But she's cold. At least, close the door, Zoe." His voice was louder this time, echoing down the hallway. "It's late. Everyone minds their own life." I heard every word. It wasn't the first time Paul said things like that, but hearing it in this situation. It exposed him in a way that felt almost cruel. He didn't know the woman sitting in the kitchen, the one he told her to close the door on, was his wife, the person he should at least care about. But maybe caring had disappeared from his vocabulary a long time ago. Zoe set a warm towel on my hands, moving slowly and gently so she wouldn't startle me. Don't mind him. Paul just worries about the family's safety. I looked at Zoe. She was trying to defend the man who had just dismissed me. She thought Paul was simply being cautious. She didn't know how deep that indifference ran. I'd lived next to it for years, until it became background noise I simply accepted. Zoe asked softly, "Do you have anywhere to go? Or someone I can call for you?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the steaming cup in front of me. The rising steam stung my eyes, but I didn't blink. I had to hold the act a little longer. I needed to see the honest reactions, not the ones people saved for Marion Harrington, the wealthy woman everyone chose their words around. Paul's footsteps came from behind me. "Zoe," I said. He stopped. I didn't turn around, but I could feel the air tighten instantly. Paul was standing at the edge of the kitchen, probably studying the hunched back of a homeless woman sitting in his house, someone he wanted nothing to do with. Zoe spoke first. "I just let her in for a bit. She was freezing. Paul let out a long sigh, as if this entire situation was an unnecessary burden. "Zoe, you need to avoid trouble. A stranger like this." He didn't finish the sentence. I turned my head. Slowly, very slowly. I pulled the hood off my head, the worn fabric brushing against my cheek. My messy hair fell forward, revealing my face. No makeup, no elegance, but familiar enough that he couldn't miss it. Paul froze, his expression shifting in the exact order I'd memorized over the years. Confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, fear. "Marion?" His voice was small, like someone had squeezed it out of his throat. Zoe was different. She froze for a few seconds, her eyes widening a little, but she didn't step back. She didn't try to hide me. She didn't fear I'd get angry. She just took a slightly deeper breath and said, "Oh my God, Mom, what are you doing here?" I looked straight at Paul, not with the kind of power that used to make people shrink, but with plain, stripped-down truth. He opened his mouth, closed it, unable to find a single word. Maybe he wanted to say he didn't know it was me, or that he was just protecting the family. But I didn't need to hear any of that. None of it mattered. What mattered was what happened before he knew who I was. I stood up and pulled the towel from my hands. Not angry, not sad, just cold. "Paul." I said his name the way you'd address a stranger. He answered, "Marion, I thought—" I cut him off, my voice calm enough that even I could hear the sharpness in it. "You didn't open the door, that's all." The sentence dropped between the three of us like something heavy. Not a shout, not an accusation, just the truth. But sometimes the truth is harsher than any insult. Paul tried to step closer, as if he could fix something with that one movement, but Zoe was standing between us, not to block him, just because she was looking at me, waiting to hear what I'd say next. I saw the shock on her face, but none of the shame Paul was drowning in. Zoe understood me, or at least understood enough to know I wouldn't do something like this without a reason. I looked at Paul for a few more seconds. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet mine. I didn't need to analyze anything else. I didn't need to make him feel worse. The truth had already done that on its own. One single sentence was enough. I just wanted to know who would still see me as family when I had nothing. Zoe inhaled sharply. Paul clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles turned white. No one said anything. They didn't have to. I walked past Paul to leave the kitchen. His cologne drifted past me, but it didn't make me pause the way it once did. Nothing held me beside him in that moment. No explanation could erase what I'd heard and seen with my own eyes, and in that instant I knew exactly who was the only person in this house who opened the door for me, not because I was Marion Harrington, but because I was someone who needed help. Zoe, not Paul, not my husband. No more arguments needed. The truth had already revealed itself completely. I walked out of the kitchen without looking back. I didn't need to. Everything I needed to see had already been laid out clearer than any light in this house. Zoe followed a few steps behind me, not touching, not pressing with questions, just close enough that if I stumbled, she could catch me. A quiet kind of kindness, not showy, not forced. I once thought that simplicity meant she lacked refinement. Now I understood. It was simply honesty. Paul stood in the hallway, his hands hanging awkwardly at his sides as if he didn't know where to put them to stop trembling. He looked at me, but not long enough to hold eye contact. I saw the confusion and the fear of facing what he himself had revealed. One simple truth. Zoe was the one who opened the door, not him. I stopped when I reached Paul. He shifted, like he wanted to lift a hand to stop me, but he didn't. His hand rose halfway, then dropped. A small motion, but enough to tell me everything about the man standing in front of me. He didn't step toward me when I needed him, and now, when he finally wanted to, he was too late. Zoe stood a few steps away. She looked at Paul, then at me, her eyes worried but honest. She didn't cover for Paul, but she didn't push him further into shame either. She just watched me, as if waiting to see what I'd choose to say. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Whatever explanation Paul might give would only water down the truth hanging in the air between the three of us. I took a slow breath. For the first time in years, that breath didn't carry the familiar scent of expensive perfume. Just dust, cold air, and the real smell of myself. Maybe that was good for me. I glanced at Zoe. Her eyes didn't shy away. They weren't waiting for me to apologize. They weren't waiting for praise. They were just the eyes of someone who did the right thing without needing validation. I spoke softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Thank you." She blinked. Maybe she didn't expect me, someone who'd always treated softness as weakness, to say that to her. But I said it because it was true, and because tonight, simple truth was worth more than anything I'd ever owned. I turned to Paul. He opened his mouth. "Marion, I didn't know it was you. I cut him off with a short sentence, light but as cold as the wind outside our gate tonight. "You don't need to know who I am to treat me kindly." Paul stood frozen. No excuses about safety, no defending himself, no more wrong words. He understood the weight of what I'd said. This wasn't an argument. This was truth. And truth doesn't need a raised voice to cut deep. A long moment passed. No one moved. I felt the whole familiar, spacious house change shape around me. It was no longer a symbol of my authority. It was simply a place filled with people who had chosen to live according to who they really were. Zoe chose to open the door. Paul chose to turn away. And me? Tonight I chose to see clearly. I walked toward the front door, my hand wrapped around the cold metal handle. Zoe followed a couple of steps behind, as if to make sure I wouldn't stumble in those old worn clothes. I turned back to look at her for a moment. "It's not your fault," I said. "It never was." Zoe pressed her lips together, her eyes turning red, but refusing to let a single tear fall. That restraint surprised me. She was stronger than her gentle exterior suggested. I had misread that all along. I opened the door. The night air rushed in, colder than when I'd arrived. But this time, it didn't cut through me the way it had earlier. It felt more like I was opening a different kind of door, the one I'd been afraid to touch, leaving Paul not by divorce, but by letting go of the expectations I'd clung to. I stepped outside. I didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, I heard Paul call my name with actual emotion in his voice. "Marion, where are you going?" I paused for a second. I didn't turn around. "Out for a while," I said, "to remember who I am when I'm not standing inside that house." No anger, no heartbreak, just the calm of someone finally seeing clearly after years of blurring her own vision. I heard Paul's footsteps, but they weren't coming toward me. They were retreating. He didn't follow. He didn't try to stop me. And in that moment, the harshest truth settled. He only knew how to hold on to me when I was the version of myself he found useful. The version without power. The woman standing outside her own door was never on his list of priorities. And when I accepted that, my chest felt lighter. As if I'd just taken off a golden chain I'd mistaken for jewelry for far too many years. I stepped down the front steps, the door closing behind me. No crying, no apology, just the soft click of the latch touching the frame, the sound of an ending I didn't need to witness. Paul lost his power at the exact moment I stopped needing him. The next morning, I returned to the mansion, not in torn clothes, not as a homeless stranger. I wore a simple coat, not to prove anything, but because I wanted to walk in as myself, without power, without a role. Zoe was the one who opened the door again. She looked at me, not startled, not wary, just her usual gentleness, though this time I finally saw it clearly. "Are you all right, Mom?" Her voice held no judgment, no question about why I did what I did. Just a simple, honest concern that didn't make me feel weak. I stepped inside. The kitchen was quiet, morning light spilling across the countertop. I stood across from Zoe. She waited, and I knew exactly what I needed to say. "Zoe," I began, my voice steady, "I've seen you wrong." She blinked, waiting for what came next. "I judged you by what I thought was the standard, not because you were wrong." I paused for a moment, but because I never stepped down far enough to see you the right way. That apology was short, clean, not begging for forgiveness, but inside it was the truth I'd never spoken. And I knew Zoe heard it. She exhaled softly, no tears, no dramatic movie-style embrace. She just nodded, slow and steady. "I know you have your reasons for being strict, but I never wanted to go against you." She wasn't defending herself. She was telling me she hadn't held on to the things I'd done to her. I looked at her for a long moment. For the first time, I saw who she was instead of the version I'd built in my head. Zoe wasn't lacking class. She just didn't carry the kind of class I was used to. She didn't try to please me by imitating me. She lived with her own sincerity, something many wealthy people can't hold on to. "Thank you," I said, a sentence I never thought I'd say to her, yet saying it made me feel lighter again. Zoe replied, "I just did what anyone should do, Mom." Not overly humble, not proud, just true. We sat at the table. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't tense. It was calm, real. Neither of us tried to force common ground, but somehow the distance between two stubborn women in two very different ways suddenly felt shorter. I brought up last night. No long speech. "You were the only one who opened the door." Zoe lowered her eyes, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't know it was you, but even if I had known, I still would have opened it." That sentence, to me, was enough to shift an entire relationship. I left the house an hour later. The morning air cleared my head. I saw Paul standing at the far end of the steps, watching me but not coming closer. There were no words between us. I didn't need any. The distance had been there for a long time. Last night only made it visible. As I walked down the gravel path, I realized something every powerful person eventually has to face. When you lose your position, you see who actually stays. Zoe opened the door. Paul closed it. A small action, but the biggest answer I could have received. I didn't blame Paul. I didn't resent him. I simply accepted him as the person he had chosen to become. I no longer needed him to be the ideal version of a man I once believed in. His refusal last night was enough to show he wasn't ready to stand beside me when I no longer had the power that once protected him. But Zoe was different. She didn't change me with long speeches. She changed me with one simple action, opening the door for someone she thought was a stranger, someone she had never truly been seen by. I understood the lesson clearer than ever. Don't dislike someone before you understand them. And if the person you once looked down on still opens the door for you, look at yourself first. I turned back to the house one last time. Not with ownership, not with pride, just as someone looking at a place that held a truth she needed to learn. Then I said one sentence, cool, steady, and the most grown thing I could offer. Power won't tell you who loves you. Actions will. I walked away, leaving the door behind. And if you're hearing this story, I want to ask you something. If someone stood at your door with nothing left, would you open it or would you close it? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. That's the end of the story. Thank you so much for supporting me all this time.